I made the big mistake of putting hand cream on right before starting this, and now he's licking. In 1977, the Hodgson family, living in a quiet suburb of North London, was about to experience a terrifying ordeal when strange things started happening in their home. Unexplained noises, furniture moving on its own, objects flying through the air, ghostly voices, and even instances of human levitation. These events terrified the poor family and left everyone wondering if the events were real or if it was all just one big hoax. Whether it was real or not, the Enfield poltergeist became a national sensation. Headlines were filled with it, and everyone was talking about 11-year-old Janet Hodgson, who seemed to be at the center of it all. Hello, and welcome back to Pugs, Tea, and the Paranormal, where we hang out with some really cute pugs, we drink some nice tea, and we talk about a very creepy, true paranormal story. I'm Leah, and this is Dexter, and this is Pootie Bear. Tonight we are talking about the Enfield poltergeist, so grab yourself a cup of tea, snuggle up with a pug or an animal, and let's get going. Cheers. The story begins in the late summer of 1977 at 284 Green Street, where Peggy Hodgson and her 4 children, 12-year-old Margaret, 11-year-old Janet, 10-year-old Johnny, and 7-year-old Billy were enjoying the last days of summer. Okay. I think Dexter is really cold right now, so I'm just going to let him hang out under the covers. Now, just before the children were set to start another school year, the terrifying and bizarre sequence of events unfolded. And it may have all started with a simple Ouija board. Janet and Margaret had reportedly played with a spirit board before the poltergeist activity began. Some believe that their interaction with this board accidentally opened a channel to the spirit world, allowing evil forces to enter their home. Many believe that the Ouija board, if not used properly and with a certain level of respect, can act as a doorway for spirits to come through. Just as you open a physical door to allow someone to enter your home, using a Ouija board can potentially open a metaphysical door, allowing spirits to cross over into our reality. If the users don't know how to properly close it, this door may remain partially or even fully open, enabling entities from the other side to cross over into our world. Now, like so many hauntings, at first, things seemed more peculiar than they did scary. Initially, the family would hear unsettling scratching and knocking sounds coming from within the home. Now, this being a council house, these sounds were initially attributed to the neighbors, but as you'll soon find out, that was not the case. The knocking would move to different rooms, and it would occur at random hours of the day and night. The knocks were faint at first, but they grew loud enough for even the neighbors to hear them. At first, Peggy attributed them to plumbing issues or settling foundations, or again, the neighbors. But they eventually got so loud that they were no longer able to be ignored. There was also a strange coldness that would only show up in certain areas of the home, and no matter how much they tried to heat those rooms, the coldness remained. And these spooky but relatively harmless events would only escalate. So, some people believe that in order to gain strength and sustain themselves in our world, spirits must first instill fear and distress in the victims that they are haunting. And this theory suggests that the initial phase of a haunting often involves mild tactics like knocking and moving things around the house. These spooky but initially minor events will then escalate into much scarier ones, creating a tense and unsettling atmosphere in the home. And this growing fear that it creates is what is believed to feed negative entities and essentially make them stronger. And in the Enfield case, this is exactly what happened. Come here, sweetie. That's okay. So, in the Enfield case, this is exactly what happened. It started with some simple chills and some knocking on the walls, and these quickly escalated into terrifying disturbances. And it all began on August 30th. So that night, Peggy was downstairs, and she believed that all 4 children were sleeping in their bedrooms. Suddenly, she hears this disturbingly loud noise coming from one of their upstairs rooms. She rushes upstairs to a terrified Janet and Johnny, who tell her that their beds had been shaking and moving around on their own. Thinking that it was just the children having a laugh, she let it go. She told them to knock it off and get back to bed. But the same exact thing happened again the next night. It was late and the children were supposed to be sleeping when, once again, Peggy hears this incredibly loud noise, like something very heavy is being dragged across the upstairs floor. She rushes upstairs, this time a little bit angry that they were playing games with her, and Janet promises her it wasn't them, saying that their chest of drawers had been sliding across the floor all on its own. Peggy sees that this heavy piece of furniture is out of place, and it is sitting in the middle of their bedroom. Shockingly, she then witnesses this dresser slide across the girls' floor towards the doorway, almost as if something was trying to trap the girls in there with it. She immediately goes to the dresser, and she slides it back into the position against the wall. It then moved again, in front of all of them. Peggy goes over to it again, determined to move it back into its place. But shockingly, she finds that the dresser will not move. She tries to push it, but it won't budge. She could feel an invisible force pushing back against her. Something was not allowing her to move it. Now, this event, understandably, terrified her. With her rational mind, she was telling herself that it must have somehow been the children just playing around. But at the same time, she knew that something was clearly preventing her from moving this dresser. She could physically feel it. So this, with the strange knocking and the cold spots, made her not want to take any chances. So she grabbed the children, she ran next door to the neighbors, Peggy and Vic Nottingham, for safety. So the Nottinghams were already well aware of the strange knocking sounds coming from the Hodgson's home, but they didn't know what to make of Peggy's story about the dresser moving by itself. But Vic, he was a contractor by trade, so he volunteered to go and investigate the house for them while the family stayed behind with his wife. Entering the home, he immediately hears the knocking sounds, and he notes that they seem to be following him around the house as he investigates. He went to the bedroom, and he found no visible cause for what would have made the chest of drawers move by itself. And despite a thorough search throughout the home, the source of the knocking remained a mystery. And Vic concluded that the only thing they could really do was call the police.
been sitting listening to the knocking, and the woman next door, she called me in. We couldn't make out what it was. I heard the knocking as I walked in the front door, but I went all over the house, checked it, checked the walls, checked everything. Just couldn't make out what it was. So in the end, I thought to myself, well, there's only one thing. I'll call the police.
What? Just you and me, buddy. So 2 constables arrive at the home around 1 in the morning, and they too experience the knocking sounds. Now, despite a thorough search of the home, they can't provide any explanation for the knocking or for the chest of drawers having moved. Shortly after, the constables witness a ghostly event for themselves. An armchair began to wobble, and then an invisible force slid the chair across the floor in front of them. This is a direct quote from one of them. There were 4 distinct taps on the wall, and then silence. About 2 minutes later, I heard more tapping from a different wall. The other police constable checked the walls, the attic, and the pipes, but could find nothing to explain the knocking. The eldest son of the family pointed to a chair next to the sofa. I then saw the chair slide across the floor. It moved approximately 3 to 4 feet and then came to rest. I checked the chair, but I could find nothing to explain how it had moved. Unquote.
The local police could find no explanation for the knocking either. They were even more baffled when 2 of their beat constables reported seeing an armchair levitate across the Hodgson's living room.
It came off the floor, or maybe a ½ inch, I should say, and I saw it slide off to the right, about 3.5 to 4 feet before it came to rest. I checked to see whether or not it could possibly have slid along the floor. I placed a marble on the floor to see whether or not the marble would go in the same direction as the chair did, and it didn't roll at all. I checked for wires under the cushion of the chair, and I could find no explanation at all.
So Vic Nottingham would later say that these 2 police officers who came that night really wanted to get out of that house, simply because they were just as freaked out as he was. And it was here where you can start to see just how big this case was about to get. Just like in the Lindley Street haunting, the number of credible witnesses that would experience unexplainable events is pretty intriguing. So the next night, Vic returned to the house to help Peggy again because the knocking had only gotten worse. He heard the knocking again, but this time he was also attacked by some unseen force. Lego pieces had started flying around the room on their own, and one of these tiny little pieces hit him in the arm so hard that it actually left a welt.
The police definitely wanted to get out of the house.
How could you tell?
Dave was as frightened as I was. And then the second night we went back in there again, and we got the same reactions again. We got this knocking. And then this here Lego. I witnessed a box of Lego underneath a chair, but I walked into the room. As I walked into the room, the Lego began to fly. But where it was coming from, I don't know. One piece hit me on the arm. And
did it hurt?
Oh, it brought a lump up. It caught me on the elbow, and it brought a lump up. And as I
one
say,
tiny little piece?
One tiny little piece of Lego. Now, it's not much bigger than 3/4 inch. But it caught me on the elbow. And as I say, it brought a lump up.
And this was only the beginning of the strange and frightening physical things that this entity would go on to do. Peggy was at a loss at this point. Her neighbors had witnessed the events, and even the police had seen some strange things. The police couldn't do much since no laws were broken, no crime had been committed either. So Vic suggested contacting the Daily News to see if they could send some reporters to the house to investigate. In an interview as an adult, Janet said that they made this call simply out of desperation for any sort of help. They had nobody else to turn to. So reporter Doug Bentz answered the phone when Vic made the call that night. He said that there was a ruckus at his neighbor's house, saying, quote, "It's gone potty next door. We've got hysterical women talking about ghosts. Something strange is happening, things are flying around, and furniture is moving," unquote. The newspaper assumed that Vic was actually drunk when he made this call, but it was a slow night, so he and photographer Graham Morris decided to head over and take a look. They did not believe that anything said on the phone was true, obviously. They just assumed that they might get like a little filler piece out of the experience. So they get to the house and they find Vic, Peggy, and the children in the home, where everything for the time being had seemed to calm down. Nothing paranormal was going on. Peggy felt bad, so she invited them all in for tea. They chatted briefly about the events, and then the reporters headed to their car. Just as they reached their car, however, Vic came outside, screaming, "It's happening again. It's happening again." And they rushed back inside to what they then described as pandemonium. Doug said, quote, "Lego bricks were flying around, and Graham was hit with one hard enough to bruise his face. It's hard to say how many, but it was quite a short period of about a minute. The young boy was playing in it. The two girls were screaming and crying. The mother was in a state. Vic Nottingham was doing his best. There is no question that they had engineered it in any way," unquote. So the reporters were stunned by what they had seen. And over the next few days, they returned to the Hodgson house with senior reporter George Fallows. Within a week, they witnessed enough incredible events, like saucers flying across the kitchen, dishes shattering spontaneously, furniture moving on its own, and toys flying through the air, to write a front-page story for the Daily Mirror. Interestingly, Janet was always at the center of these ghostly happenings. In an interview for the movie The Conjuring 2, which was based loosely off these events, Graham Morris himself said that, quote, "Whenever Janet walked into the room, things just suddenly took off. Wherever Janet was, it just seemed to happen. Kids are kids, and they'll do funny little things for attention, but not the things that we were witnessing there. They couldn't have done them. They weren't even in the same room at the time. I quite believe that what I was watching was genuine. In addition to the Lego and toys, chairs would tip up, beds would turn over, drawers would fly out in rooms that nobody was even in. It was real," unquote. It was also during these visits when Graham managed to take a picture of Janet seemingly levitating. He had set up a camera and tripod in their room, and the photo showed Janet hovering above her bed in a nightgown. This photo here became famous among people who believe in the paranormal, seen as proof of the poltergeist existence in this case. But Doug and many skeptics were not convinced. "She wasn't actually levitating," Doug said. "It's just an illusion caused by the camera angle. If you take a picture from low down, it can make things look different," unquote. Regardless, the reporters had still witnessed some pretty spooky happenings, and it was after this photo that they contacted the Society for Psychical Research. So the Society for Psychical Research, also known as SPR, is a UK-based non-profit that investigates things like psychic abilities and paranormal events. Founded in 1882, the SPR does not take sides on these issues. They focus on carefully researching and exploring these phenomena. And when the reporters contacted them, SPR sent Maurice Grosse to investigate the case. Maurice was an inventor and a paranormal researcher who had pretty recently joined the organization. Sadly, he had lost his daughter in a motorcycle accident the previous year. This tragic event led him to explore the paranormal and try to understand what happens after death. Besides the SPR, Morris also joined the Ghost Club, another paranormal research group based in London. This one was founded in 1862 and is believed to be the oldest organization of its kind in the world, which I thought was pretty cool. His first night there, he and Peggy were downstairs when they heard a loud crash come from the girls' bedroom. They rushed upstairs to find the girls sound asleep in their beds, but a chair had been thrown upside down and was lying on the floor. The events would only escalate from here. Around the time Morris began investigating, the media had really begun to pick up the story of this supposedly haunted council house. In addition to the newspaper, several radio stations were also talking about the story, and BBC Radio 4 actually sent a radio host to the Enfield home to investigate the haunting for herself. During her visit, Roz Morris herself witnessed a chair moving on its own, having been thrown 9 feet across the room. In this interview, you can clearly hear how shaken up she is from this event, saying to Morris, quote, "I hope the microphone is not shaking in my hand, as that was a rather unnerving experience," unquote. That night, she would also witness one of the children's beds shaking. She turned her investigation into a 40-minute long radio documentary, which was broadcast in December of 1978. That documentary contained recordings of the unexplained knocking sounds supposedly made by the poltergeist. Had the world just heard the first actual recording of someone from beyond the grave? Let me know what you think.
I first visited the house on September the 10th, 1977, and it was on my second visit a month later in October that I was able to hear and to record the knocking sounds that you've already heard. That evening, the Hodgsons were trying to get to sleep in the front bedroom of the house. Although the house has 3 bedrooms, the family at that stage preferred to sleep all together in the same room. While they were attempting to settle down to go to sleep, Mrs. Hodgson's brother and his wife and son were with me on the landing of the house, while Guy Playfair was downstairs in the main living room. That's the room directly beneath the front bedroom. We began to hear knocking sounds at about 10:30, and they appeared to be coming from the floors and walls of the upper part of the house. This is what they sounded like when they started. After these sounds began, everyone in the house except the Hodgsons went into the downstairs living room and tried to work out where the knocks were coming from.
Before meeting Peggy, Roz Morris was pretty skeptical, but Peggy's sincerity and genuine fear convinced her, and her own experiences in the house left Roz bewildered and leaning more towards belief. On Sunday, September 25th, the activity seemed to be escalating. It got to the point where Peggy needed to just get out of the house. So she and the family went a few doors down for a visit with her brother John and his wife Cynthia. While Cynthia was making everybody tea, she saw a children's toy hovering in the air before abruptly falling onto her kitchen counter. It seemed that whatever was haunting the Hodgson home was attached to somebody in the family and had invited itself into the house. Or, even creepier, it had the power to simply leave the Hodgson home and go wherever it pleased. On another occasion, one with a more dangerous undertone, The family was having some friends over for dinner to try and forget the scary events for a night. A friend named Anne Calloway said, quote, "We were all trying to have a nice dinner, just a nice, calm dinner, to forget the chaos for a moment. Suddenly, the cutlery on the table started to rattle and a knife lifted into the air. It hovered for a moment and then it dropped back down. It was as if something unseen was trying to join us at the table." Unquote. Now, I don't know if it was because the case was blowing up in the news or if they really thought that Morris was just in over his head. But at this point, the SPR decided to send some backup to the Enfield home. They sent expert researcher Guy Lyon Playfair, a British writer, journalist, and paranormal researcher who had worked for Life magazine. He was already respected in the paranormal community, but became somewhat famous for his work in this case. Gross and Playfair noted almost immediately that the activity was primarily centered around the two girls, Janet and Margaret. Now, Janet seemed to experience the worst of it, but strange things did happen to Margaret as well. In one instance, Margaret was trying to walk up the stairs when she claimed that something had a hold of her leg and, quote, wouldn't let her leave, unquote. The researchers saw that Margaret's leg was held up behind her as she tried to ascend the stairs, and it reportedly took several people to free her from this strange invisible grasp. The early events with Janet included strange whistles and talking coming from her general direction. She would then be levitated against her will, or she would go into strange trances from which she could not recall any details. Interestingly, when the girls were separated and sent to stay in different homes for the night, the same incidents would occur in both places. At one point, the family was able to escape for a week-long vacation, a much-needed one. Peggy and the kids desperately needed this break, and for those 7 days, they felt at peace. Back at the house, however, activity was escalating, as Morris had actually begun to communicate with the poltergeist. Whoever it was, and wherever it had come from, it was showing some form of intelligence. Morris started simple, asking yes or no questions. 1 knock on the wall meant no, 2 meant yes. He found out that the spirit was male, that he used to live in that house, and that he had died there. When Morris asked if the spirit was unhappy, it said no. He asked if it had a message for the family, and again, no. Then Morris asked if it was just playing games with him, and that was when a cardboard box and a pillow was thrown at him. Morris asked him why it was tormenting the family, if it enjoyed scaring them, and the answer, 2 knocks for yes. Morris asked it to go away, but the entity only responded with a bunch of singular knocks. The poltergeist had also begun communicating in other ways. Peggy had decided to try and speak with it herself in an attempt to make it leave. She left pens and notebooks around the house and invited the spirit to write to her. She wasn't disappointed. Within a few minutes, handwriting which she did not recognize had appeared on the paper, reading, quote, "I will stay in the house. Do not read this to anyone, or I will retaliate," unquote. On another occasion, while Morris was trying to communicate with it, he witnessed a lamp violently unplug itself from the wall 3 times and then fall over. A slipper was then thrown towards him from across the room. It was clearly aimed at him, but missed and hit the door instead. In addition to the communication, Morris and Playfair witnessed furniture moving and being turned upside down. One night, while standing in a room with 12 other witnesses, Morris saw a sofa, no more than a couple of feet in front of him, levitate straight up into the air and then turn upside down. Countless instances like this occurred, but just to name a few others, beds would flip over, chairs would fly across rooms, drawers of desks would fly out in rooms that were unoccupied, and the intense tapping and knocking continued to emanate from the walls. After communicating with the poltergeist through the knocking, Morris set up a recorder in the girl's bedroom and challenged the entity to actually speak to him. He believed that it was capable of communicating in a more advanced way. After this challenge, the entity then supposedly began whistling, growling, and making barking noises. And this was all captured on audio.
You'll hear here the whistling first of all, and then the barking.
And here is this noise.
The barking here is quite extraordinary, actually.
We got a doggy here.
Morris then told the entity, okay, if you can make all of those sounds, then you should be capable of actually talking to me. So, I challenge you to say my full name, Morris Gross. And this is what he recorded in that room. And no matter how many times I listen to this, I still get chills.
I then, as I said on the tape here, I then said to it, if you can whistle and bark and groan, then you can talk. And I asked it to actually say my name.
Well, just a minute. Right, we'll try again. I want you to call out my name. My complete name, Morris Gross. See if you can do that. Hello. Very good. Let me hear you say my name again. Come on, let me hear you say my name. Come on, my name's Morris. Let me hear you say it. Morris.
Now that was the first time we heard the voice, and since then we've been hearing it again and again, and it's been getting louder.
So a couple of days
louder.
after this deep male voice began presenting itself, it started speaking through Janet, and sometimes, but not often, her sister as well. And it's believed that the spirits were using Janet's voice box to speak from their side to communicate. And please keep in mind that this was an 11-year-old little girl, and she was producing this very deep, very gruff male voice. The voice would eventually speak through Janet and tell Morris that he was the spirit of the man who had previously lived in the house. His name was Bill Wilkins. Morris asked him how he had died, and the voice responded through Janet, saying, quote, I went blind. I had a hemorrhage, and I fell asleep, and I died in a chair in the corner downstairs. Unquote.
I want you to tell me whether you remember what happened to you when you died. Just before you died and just after you died.
days before I died, I went blind. Then I had an hemorrhage and I fell asleep and I died in a chair in the corner downstairs.
Everything in this claim, information that Janet had no knowledge of, would turn out to be completely true. During an LBC interview, Morris played the recording of that voice claiming to be Bill, and unexpectedly, a listener named Terry recognized that voice as that of his late father. His name was William Bill Charles Wilkins. He recognized the voice. Terry revealed that his father had indeed lived in that Enfield house, and tragically, he had gone blind and died of an internal hemorrhage while sitting in a chair downstairs. And this happened on June 20th, 1963. Investigators contacted Terry and they played this tape for him in person. And again, he confirmed that it was the voice of his father, and the claims that the ghost was making were completely true. Recording sessions where these ghostly voices would come through Janet lasted for hours at a time. These were not a few minutes here and there. Like, Bill and the other ghosts would talk through Janet for hours, and it would be in these deep male voices. And for me, this is seriously the creepiest part of the story. I'll be honest, like, at first I thought, there's no way, like, that's such a stupid ghost story. Like, of course the girls are doing these voices. But the more research I did, just listen. Every time these voices would speak, Janet's mouth would not be moving. The investigators had vocal coaches, speech therapists, and ventriloquists come in to see if Janet was perhaps ventriloquizing the voice. Ventriloquizing? I think that's how you say it. But it was determined that she was not. In a 2011 interview, Janet said, quote, "I knew when the voices were happening, of course, and it felt like something was behind me all the time," unquote. And Janet was also completely aware of when the voices were speaking. Like, she could hear them, but she had no control over them. And she has remained adamant till this day that they were always behind her and never coming from within her. In a 2012 interview, Guy Playfair talked about how one of the speech therapists who had come in to speak with Janet at the time, she heard for herself these ghostly voices coming from this little girl. She had no explanation for how she was making these voices, and it terrified her so much that the speech therapist ran out of the room and refused to be interviewed afterwards. That's how scared she was. So, obviously, I think most people who look at this case for the first time are instantly going to say that the voices were faked, just like I did. However, there were a lot of tests done to try and disprove this. Morris tested Janet by getting her to put tape over her lips and getting her to hold a large mouthful of water. The voice of Bill and other spirits continued to talk while she was doing this. Researchers also found that while the voice was definitely coming from Janet, it wasn't coming from her actual vocal cords. Instead, the voice originated from her false vocal cords, also known as the ventricular folds. These are located above the true vocal cords in the larynx. They can produce sounds, but they are typically never used for speech. And using the false vocal cords for extended periods usually always results in hoarseness and even damage to the vocal cords. In addition, using these false vocal cords cannot be done for very long, and Janet did not exhibit any signs of hoarseness or sore throat from these voices, despite them speaking through her again for several hours at a time. So one day, Peggy witnessed the apparition of a man going up their stairs. She said it was only his bottom half that she could see, but he was wearing old-fashioned trousers. And it's believed that it may have been the actual only sighting of Bill. In early November, Janet suffered from a seizure. Her doctor gave her a sedative to rest, so after taking it, Peggy put her to bed. The whole family, including Peggy's brother, was downstairs when they heard this huge crash coming from Janet's bedroom. John, her uncle, raced up to Janet's room and found Margaret on the floor, but Janet was gone. He quickly searched the room, even looking under the beds, but there was no Janet. Then he saw her. Janet was in the corner of the room, lying, almost hovering over her radio. It was this really, really weird thing. Like, she was almost hovering in this extremely uncomfortable position. One of her legs is up in the air, her head is hanging down, and she was sound asleep from the sedative. It was like she was defying gravity, John said, and it made no sense.
Now, what happened in this bedroom?
Well, I heard a noise downstairs. I come up, and there was the eldest girl on the floor. But the other one's missing. So I look under this bed, I look under this one, and as I stand up, I see it. There she is, across this radio, one leg in the air, and her head hanging down. Just to prove that I wasn't mad, I yelled for my wife to come up to see what I have just seen. But she was asleep.
And after this event, the torment got even worse for Janet. She was consistently found unconscious in strange places around the home with no memory of how she had gotten there. And she now seemed to be at the center of the most dangerous and unsettling phenomena. For example, one night while the investigators were there, Morris heard a strange sound coming from the hallway, and he rushed over to see Janet sliding down the stairs head first while she was still asleep. The investigators had set up numerous audio recorders and automatic cameras around the home, and these devices not only captured unexplained lights, apparitions, noises and knockings, but also more images of Janet's alleged levitation. At this stage in the haunting, it would seem, the levitations were becoming more and more frequent, and these images became the defining image of the Enfield poltergeist. If you look it up, this is what you'll see. As an adult, and Janet herself described the feeling of the levitation as that of invisible hands on her body, and these hands would then push her up into the air. Further, she said it was really scary because you didn't know when or where you were going to land. The look on her face when she's recounting these events in an interview is truly heartbreaking. Like, you can see the anguish and the lasting impact that these experiences had on her. And whether they were real or not, you can tell that these events truly terrified her, and they still do to this day. Now, in terms of the levitation, this is where the case divides pretty sharply in opinion, because skeptics argue that Janet was simply jumping in front of the timed cameras, right? While others focus on the terrified expressions of her as well as her siblings. But whatever the case, while photos can be easily dismissed, eyewitness accounts of Janet levitating in her bedroom are harder to ignore. On at least 2 occasions, witnesses observed Janet floating in front of her bedroom window, not jumping, but slowly hovering in midair. So from the street below, Hazel Short, a crossing guard affectionately known in the UK as a lollipop lady, witnessed something extraordinary from Janet's window. Hazel was across the street from the Hodgson's house with a clear view into Janet's room. She recalled, quote, "It was around mid-afternoon after school let out. I was helping children cross the street when I saw something strange through the Hodgson's window. Janet was seemingly suspended in midair, floating horizontally like a puppet without strings. It was clear that no one was holding her up. I could not believe what I was seeing. I have watched these children grow up, and I have never believed in ghosts. But there was Janet floating near the ceiling. It was broad daylight, and there was nothing to support her that I could see. It was unnerving," unquote. Hazel also reported seeing several objects flying and hitting Janet's window before she witnessed this unusual event. A second witness, a bread delivery driver, also saw Janet floating horizontally across the room, just as Hazel had. These eyewitness accounts from people with no connection to the family really made people question if something paranormal was actually happening. Things would only continue getting worse before they got better, unfortunately. Just before Christmas that year, the family's pet goldfish died, and the voice of Bill came through Janet, taking responsibility for it. And their pet bird also died. In addition, Janet would be attacked with a curtain, and I know that they reenacted that in the Conjuring movie. An unseen force wound the fabric of the curtain around her neck so tightly that she could not free herself from it. Thankfully, Peggy found her before anything bad happened, but the events were clearly taking a dangerous turn. They were now seeing ghostly apparitions every day as well, and perhaps the scariest thing, small fires were being started in the home. And again, if you recall the Lindley Street haunting, similar things were happening there as well. No, sorry, not the Lindley Street haunting, the sanpedro haunting. Similar things were happening with that one. So interestingly, famous paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren were only minimally involved in this case, and I didn't know that because despite what the movie shows, they visited the house for just one day, and due to their fame, this obviously brought a lot of attention to them, and this apparently kind of upset the original investigators who had dedicated significant time to the case. And I think it's kind of easy to understand how they could have felt overshadowed by that, right? But regardless, Janet and Margaret did talk about how fond they were of Ed and Lorraine, simply because of how much peace and relief they brought to them, even during their short visit. They felt very safe with them. During their visit, though, Lorraine Warren did state that she sensed a spirit there. She described it as not inherently evil, but it was definitely not benign. Creepy. So in 1978, a priest visited the house, and while he never publicly disclosed his actions inside, the paranormal activity did gradually subside after this, eventually stopping altogether. Whether the priest's intervention played a role is still unclear. Interestingly, he claimed to sense the presence of a 24-year-old female spirit. He couldn't identify her, but he believed that she was somehow connected to the house. It's a pretty chilling coincidence that Maurice Gross's daughter also named Janet, was 24 when she passed away. So, the Enfield haunting did not abruptly end. Instead, paranormal activity gradually subsided. Furniture movements became less frequent, objects stopped flying, and the eerie voices just grew fainter. And another possible explanation for the decline in activity is the reduced media attention. As the case faded from the headlines, the intense scrutiny on the young girls obviously lessened. And it's believed that this likely reduced their subconscious influence on the events. This is significant because, as seen in other cases like the Lindley Street haunting, investigators link emotional stress, particularly in young girls, to poltergeist activity. Many experts believe that the stress experienced by the family, especially the young girls, fueled and amplified the paranormal occurrences there. Pretty interesting. So, in conclusion, the Enfield haunting has faced pretty significant criticism, like just way too much to get into here. But just to go over a few of the most popular, Janet and Margaret did acknowledge to faking some of the events. They say that it was only 2%, and they only did it to keep investigators engaged. And this was simply because of how scared they were. They didn't want investigators to leave at the time because with them, they felt safe and protected. And they were scared that even if the event stopped for just a couple of hours, people would leave. Their protectors would leave. In addition, when it came to the voice of Bill, numerous inconsistencies exist. This includes similarities between Bill's and Janet's speech patterns. Bill also exhibited an unusual interest in topics typically associated with female adolescents. I don't know. I think it's because I want to be such a big believer. I want to believe. I personally just can't get over the fact that Bill's son recognized his voice. So I don't know about that one. But also, and perhaps one of the biggest critiques, a lot of skeptics believe that Maurice Gross's personal loss might have ultimately biased his investigation in this haunting. They argue that his desire to find an afterlife influenced his interpretation of the events, potentially leading him to overemphasize or even fabricate paranormal occurrences in this case. Since his daughter was also named Janet, they think that this could have further biased his findings. However, those who believe in the haunting argue that his personal loss actually provided him with a unique empathy and a stronger motivation to help the Hodgson family in their time of need. They say that his personal connection made him more dedicated and helped him build trust with his family, leading to more accurate observations. I like that. In addition, many skeptics claim that the Enfield haunting was a hoax orchestrated by the family simply because they wanted to move to a better council house. When asked her opinion about this, journalist Roz Morris, who went to the home, said the following, quote, "That's not factually true. Mrs. Hodgson did not want to move, and in fact, she lived in the house on Green Street for nearly 40 years, and she died there in the house in 2003. The family did not make money out of this poltergeist, which, even in the much less frantic media times of 40 years ago, they could have done. I simply don't know what was happening at Enfield just over 40 years ago, but what I do know is that in a long career as a journalist and broadcaster, This is the strangest and most disturbing story that I have ever reported on," unquote. After Peggy passed away in 2003, a woman named Claire Bennett and her 4 sons moved into the Enfield home. She was asked if she had experienced anything odd while living there, and she said that she never saw anything, but she always felt uncomfortable, that there was definitely some kind of presence in the house, and she always felt like somebody was watching her. It was only after this interview that she found out about the history of the home. She wasn't aware of it until then. She and her boys only lived there for 2 months before abruptly moving out. Morris Gross said that this case was the best documented haunting of that century, and as far as documentation, it may have been the best case of all time. But even in the face of genuine evidence, skeptics will always point out the lack of repeatability in paranormal investigations, right? They argue that hauntings disappear under scientific scrutiny. If ghosts are real, why can't we create the conditions and observe them again? And it was funny because I was telling Eric about this, and he literally said almost the same exact thing. I was telling him about how creepy it was that Janet held water in her mouth and the voices were still coming through. And he said, well, that is really creepy, but so many studies have been done where ghost sightings and paranormal evidence can never be replicated in properly done experiments. But what if the answer to this kind of lies in the very nature of the paranormal? Like if they exist, maybe ghosts operate outside the boundaries of our current understanding, like beyond the rules of cause and effect. And what if they're kind of glimpses of a reality that we cannot comprehend, or we can barely comprehend? Whether the Enfield events were genuine or a complex hoax, one thing is undeniable, and that is that this case seriously freaked me out. In a 2012 interview, Guy Lyon Playfair said the following, quote, "It's not supernatural. If it takes place in nature, then it's natural. It's just not understood," unquote. And I don't know why. I think it's because I'm such a lover of paranormal things, but that quote really resonated with me. And I think that that is the perfect way to end this video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, can you please hit the like button and subscribe? It would mean the world to us and help us grow our new little channel here. Thank you so much for watching. We will see you in the next one. Cheers.